Let's test our new isValidChain function. For this function, we have three possibilities to consider for the tests. First, we should ensure that it validates a valid chain. Second, we should make sure that it invalidates a chain with a corrupt genesis block. Third, finally, we should make sure that it invalidates a chain with a corrupt block at some point in the chain that is not the genesis block. So make sure you're in blockchain-test.js, and let's add a new unit test. This time, we'll make sure that it validates a valid chain for this test. And then we have our arrow function for the second parameter. Now, because of the before each function, this unit test is going to have a valid BC variable to it that will be a new blockchain instance. To check whether it can validate a new chain though, we'll need a second chain to work with. So in addition to having a fresh blockchain instance called BC, let's have a second one called BC2. So let's declare a BC2 variable alongside BC at the top. And then in the before each function, let's assign that BC2 variable also to a new blockchain instance. Now within our test that checks whether it validates a valid chain, let's add a block to the second blockchain instance. And for the block, let's store a string of foo. Now we can run a test that takes the chain of the second blockchain instance, and then we'll validate that chain using the first blockchain instance. So we'll call the valid chain method of the first blockchain instance and pass the chain of the second instance. And since all we've done is add one block, this should be valid for now. We haven't messed with the data, so it should be okay. So we're going to expect that if we use the isValidChain method of the first blockchain instance, and then we pass in the chain of the second instance, well, we want this to be true. And then I say to be because we're going to actually use the to be method, which is the more conventional method to use for true or false assertions in Jest. All right, let's save this. And let's actually go ahead and go back to the command line and run the test scripts. So that's npm run test. You may still have it running. And then it should pick up the new test with 5 in total so far. And indeed, it validates the valid chain of the second blockchain instance. Great. Now we can add 2 additional tests to continue checking this isValidChain method, this time invalidating corrupt chains. For the first invalidation test, we'll make sure that it invalidates a chain with the wrong genesis block. So let's add a method that says it invalidates a chain with a corrupt genesis block. Within this test, let's corrupt the first element of the second blockchain and make sure its genesis block it's incorrect. So we're going to take the bc2.chain, we'll access the first element, which is the genesis block. We'll change this data to something like bad data. And now that genesis block is incorrect. And now when we run this same validation check, so we'll use the isValidChain method of the first instance again, passing in the chain of our second instance. Well, we want this to be false because this genesis block should have incorrect data. Now, as we save this, well, we get a 6th passing test in our Jest runner now. Awesome. Finally, we'll have one more test, and this time we'll make sure that it invalidates a corrupt chain, period. It invalidates a corrupt chain is the message. And the goal of this test will be to invalidate a corrupt chain that has a bad block that isn't necessarily the genesis block. So let's have the body of our function over here. And to make a bad block that isn't the genesis block, well, we have to add a block first. So how about adding a block of foo to the second blockchain instance? And then we'll immediately corrupt that data by accessing the element at the first position, or rather at index 1, which is going to be this foo block. And then we'll change its data immediately to something else. So how about the string of not foo? So it's immediately clear what's going on. And then again, we run the same check, which you can copy from the other test. So you're going to expect that the bc.isValidChain, so the isValidChain method of the first instance, you want it to invalidate the chain of the second method, which has the bad foo block now, and you expect it to be false. So once you save this, If all goes well, you should have a 7th passing test. And there we have it. We've completely tested our isValidChain method now. Great. Let's move on and support the functionality now that replaces the current blockchain's chain if the incoming chain is indeed valid.